Hello, this is Dr. Jerry Lloyd, and yesterday we started hopefully a series maybe on Genesis, and we started with chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Today, we're going to continue that with verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Now, what in the world does all that mean? This is Dr. Jerry Lloyd, and we are providing Bible study and on the Word of God. You might say that we kind of go along with, or I'm also on genuine biblical transparency, where we try and see, the things that are actually in the Bible, and that what are the, traditions and things that we see in the Bible that really aren't true to what the Bible has to say. So we're going to look at this verse and see if we can discern some things. Actually, I'm going to present some things that are of dubious content, so that you can kind of decide for yourself what they and why we believe them. So, as we read in Genesis 1, verse 2, he says, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." What in the world does all that stuff mean? And it sounds pretty straightforward, and actually it very is very much. And so we find out that, well, he's saying that the earth was without form and void. That means it's void we think of as being purposeless. That's not necessarily what it means in the Hebrew, the word for this. And without form, that it doesn't mean that it was just a gas or something like that. Don't get confused with some of the fairy tales that used to come out. It's amazing how many things that used to be taught in science when I was growing up, and when I was at University of South Florida and taking biology and things like that, and how much that has been actually debunked. And so we want to see what the truth is. And what does this say? Well, the earth was without form and void, but I want you to see a couple of things here that in Isaiah chapter 45, verse 18, God says this: "For thus saith the Lord that created the heavens, God himself that formed the earth and made it. He hath established it. He created it not vain." Not without, not void, or he didn't create it. Why? What does he say? Let's see what it says in the rest of the verse, and it kind of explains what I'm kind of getting out there. He formed it to be inhabited. Well, it obviously was not inhabitable, what it says in verse 2. But he formed it to be inhabited. Why would he form something to be inhabited and it not be inhabitable? Was that kind of a process that he went through? Well, some used to teach that, but it's not really what he's getting at. And we'll see what happened. There was actually we do not believe in a gap theory, although there may be a gap here. There is a gap theory, just so you understand what we're not teaching. There is a gap theory that says that each day and stuff like this, that there is a gap of millions or billions of years. And in the sense, that's true, possibly not. And even if what I'm saying, at any rate, just listen to what I have to say. Hear me out here, okay? And then you can decide for yourself. But first of all, we know that he did not create it void or without form. It began, in many of the translations, or an alternate translation of the word, there is became without form and void. In Isaiah 24, verse 1, God says, "Behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty," void, "maketh the earth empty." Now, notice that this was an act of God. The Lord maketh the earth empty, and maketh it waste. And that's what the word, there's words, or two words there that are form and void, that are translated form and void. And one of them is waste, very turn. And he says, the reason I said very turn is because I'm looking at the verse that says, and he turned it upside down. And scattered abroad, this is interesting, and scattered something abroad. Listen to what he says. And scattered abroad the inhabitants. Now, when it became without form and void, he scattered abroad the inhabitants. That indicates that there was a pre-Adamic race on the earth. They may not be human. I don't know what they were. And I don't know how it plays into what skeletons and things like that people have found. I believe they're just extinct peoples, races of people. I think there are a number of them that used to live back at the beginning of the Old Testament, but they later became extinct. They were all destroyed, the whole group of them. So, but here he says that he turned it upside down and scattered abroad the inhabitants. So there was a pre-Adamic race, apparently, way back at this time before the earth became without form and void. In Job 26, verse 9, he says, he holdeth back the face of his throne, speaking of God. He held back the face of his throne and spreadeth his cloud upon it. The idea there is that he shielded the earth from his face. And we believe, and we'll get to it when we get to Genesis chapter 6 and 7 and 8 and 9, where it talks about the Noah flood, that there, before the flood, there was a canopy of moisture or clouds around the earth that protected the earth from certain things, and that cloud went away at the flood. And now we still have clouds, but we no longer have a universal flood like they did for that year. And but he's talking about that, okay, I turned my face away and judgment came on that. And it may have been, when it talks about darkness was on the face of the deep, that is the same word that is sometimes translated abyss or bottomless pit. So, and what do we think of that? We think of that as being like in the deep blue sea, and there's been the idea floating around, not anymore, but it used to float around, that there is a portal in the Devil's Triangle that leads to the bottomless pit or to hell or to where the devils go, and maybe there's a portal where you can go back into. Well, not doubtful, or pretty doubtful. Not likely, maybe I should say. Let's see what happened during that interim. During the time that God created the earth to be inhabited, it was inhabited by something or someone, and it caused a great catastrophe. By some writers, they believe, and by the evidence that we have, the catastrophe was universal wide. Now, that could have been caused universe-wide, could have been caused by Adam and Eve's sin in the garden. We'll get to that some other time. But that it is the earth, and if you look at all the planets, they are really without form and void. If you look at the pictures that have come from there. But he says, let's see about what's happened. What happened in that interim is the fall of Satan and his angels. So let's read about those things. Over in Ezekiel chapter 28, we see about the fall of Satan. He says, Son of man, take up a lamentation upon the king of Tyrus, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God, Thou sealest up the sum, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. So he's talking about the king of Tyrus. Who is the king of Tyrus? Well, in the first verse of the chapter, it talks about take up a lamentation to the prince of Tyrus. Now, he was, I don't know, maybe his name was Hiram or something, but he was the king, what the men called it the king of Tyrus. But there was a spiritual backing, an evil spiritual backing of the king of Tyrus. Now, we're talking about after the Genesis. We're talking way over in the book of Ezekiel, and written shortly before the fall of Israel to Babylon. So let's see. He says we're talking about the king of Tyrus. That's the power behind the prince of power of Tyrus. He says in verse 13, "Thou hast been in Eden, the garden of God." Now wait a minute. Hiram, or whatever the king's name is, he was never in Eden, the garden of God. Now we only know really of four people that were in Eden. There was God, there was Adam and Eve, and Satan were in Eden. So it would, if we go by knowledge, it would have to be one of those four, wouldn't it? Well, let's see what it says about it. And so, it says, "Thou hast in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was thy covering, the sardius, topaz, and the diamond, and the beryl, the onyx, the jasper, the sapphire, the emerald, and the carbuncle," which, that's strange. I kind of like that name. Kind of reminds me of something that grows you the foot, But at any rate, and gold and workmanship. Listen what his talents are now. "And the workmanship of thy tabrets and thy pipes was prepared in the day." In other words, he was like a musician. He was like a music leader. And so he can use music to his advantage, I suppose, if you know much about music. It says that the workmanship of thy tabrets and thy pipes was prepared in thee in the day that thou wast. This is verse 13, if you want to follow with me. Ezekiel 28:13, he says, "In a day that thou wast created." It's talking about a created being. And that really hadn't happened for about 6,000 years in this context. He goes on and says, in verse 14, "Thou art the anointed cherub that covereth, and I have set thee." So now what does that mean, the anointed cherub that covereth? In the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. And this ark had two angels on the top of it, archangels, and they covered the mercy seat with their wings. And so the Ark of the Covenant, they had two cherubs or two angels up there, two archangels. Well, one of the archangels was Michael. Who was the other one? Maybe we need to find that out. We probably will in a minute. And so he says, "Thou hast walked up and down in the stones of fire, in the midst of the stones of fire." You might pay attention to that. The stones of fire. He walked up and down in the midst of the stones of fire. I don't know what in the world that means, but it seems to keep coming up. He goes on and says in verse 15, "Thou wast perfect in thy ways." God was not the author of sin. He says, "Thou wast perfect in all thy ways until iniquity was found in thee." So sin was found. What in the world was that sin, I wonder, that corrupted Satan? "By the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence, and thou hast sinned. Therefore I will cast thee as a cherub from the midst of the stones of fire." So, and then he goes on in verse 17. And then we see the sin here. "Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty." His sin was that his heart was lifted up. That's talking about pride. His heart being lifted up because of his beauty. "Thine heart was lifted up because of thy beauty. Thou hast corrupted thy wisdom by reason of brightness. I will cast thee into the ground. I will lay thee before, where? I will lay thee before kings, that they may behold thee." One thing to kind of take note of, just a sidelight here, if he was the heavenly choir director or music director for the group there in heaven, he can use music today for his purposes. Now, where do you suppose he will use his greatest talent, the one that is mentioned there? Well, I would say in churches today. So we need to be very careful what kind of music or what it consists of. That's another story, but just a point of interest there. I'm going to As we go on in Isaiah 14, we see what his pride, his sin of pride, his heart being lifted up, how it was manifested, what it did. In Isaiah 14, we see the addendum to the fall of Satan. It says, "And how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer?" There we see his name. And his name is Lucifer, son of the morning. How art thou cut down the ground, which didst weaken the nations. Interesting that he is involved with the nations, with the kingdoms, with the rulers of this world. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? Verse 13 of Isaiah 14. For thou hast said in thine heart. Okay, remember his heart was lifted up? How? He said in his heart, 2 words. He says more than 2 words, but 2 words to pay attention to. I will. Do you remember anybody else that said something similar? Well, I'll tell you somebody that said just the opposite. Jesus, while he was on the earth, said while he was praying to the Father, he said, nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. We ought to take note of that. When we say, I will, why did you do this? Well, I just wanted to. That's exactly the original sin in the universe. Wanting what I want. I will. And so he says, I will, for that thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also on the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, the glory. I will be like the Most High. Sounds like blasphemy almost, doesn't it? Yeah, it kind of does. But understand that God wants those things for us, all of them. But he wants it to be his way. See, we don't ascend up into heaven. We don't become like, he wants us to be like the Most High. But that's by what we call imputation. He places that to our account. He does that for us. It says, Jesus said, nevertheless, not I will, but thine be done. But he said, I will. I want to do it my way. Okay? But you know what God said in Ezekiel? I don't know if you noticed it. We kind of skipped over and talked about it. But God said about him, he says, you've been the archangel and that thing. And then he said, and I have set thee so. He was in heaven. He was the archangel, one of the 2 archangels. But God said, I have set thee so. But what did Lucifer, Satan, want? He wanted to do it his way. I will ascend up into heaven. In other words, when we try to get to heaven our way, we're doing the very same thing that Satan did. We must submit ourselves to the finished work of Jesus Christ. When he was on the cross, he said the words tetelestai, which means it is finished. He finished it. All we do is trust it. Trust his death payment. So he goes on and watch what happens. We usually stop this about here, but let's look on. He said, yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made earth to tremble and did shake the kingdoms? So he works in kingdoms. He goes on and says that made the world as wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof. At his fall, he destroyed a civilization, apparently. The inhabitants were scattered, as we read earlier, and so he was the cause of the desolation, the chaos that was on the earth. And it opened not the house of the prisoners. Well, when was this? What was this? In Revelation chapter 12, verse 7, he says this, and there was war in heaven. When? Obviously in the distant past. We'll see that in a moment. But he says, and there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, the devil. That dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven for the devil and his angels. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Now that's what happened because of his rebellion, and it brought about the war in heaven, trying to overthrow or usurp the authority of God. And it goes on, Jesus said about the devil, about this incident, he said, and he said unto them, I beheld Satan as lightning fall from heaven. So he fell, but he was cast out. So when they cast him out, he fell to the earth. He says in Jude, verse 6, and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation in heaven, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. So all those that fell with him, they are chains of darkness. Remember, darkness was on the face of the earth, and the Spirit of God brooded or moved on the waters. Hadn't got there yet. I guess that's next time we get together. But he says that they are reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the day of the judgment of the great day. 2 Peter 2:4, he refers to it this way. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, and delivered them up into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. What did he say? Over in 2 Peter chapter 3, he said, the day of the Lord will come, in which the heavens be on fire, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. And he says, well, what manner of people will we be in all holiness and godliness? Looking unto Jesus, we need to be serving the Lord until his soon coming. This is Dr. Jerry Lloyd. Thank you very much.